What's good, friends? I'm Wyatt, the Associate Youth Director at Faith UMC in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and welcome to part 2 of our Sunday School series over Revelation. In last week's video, we talked a little bit about the author, John, and why he was writing, and we read from the first message that Jesus had for the churches in Asia Minor. And this week, I want to talk about one more of these messages, and I'm leaving out 5. Check this stuff out for yourself, because you might find some really interesting things that I don't mention, or you might find some things that I do mention, but you have a completely different view or understanding of them than I have, which is even better, because between your perspective and my perspective, that's twice the brain power that we're devoting to the mystery of faith. And loving God is meant to be done with all of our hearts and souls and minds, so don't be afraid to use those noodles. Okay, let's get started. As we learned last time, John is having this spiritual trance through which he feels inspired to write messages to the churches saying what he feels Jesus wants to tell the individual congregations. And this time he's writing to a church in Pergamum. And he begins kind of like, I know that your church is located in this place surrounded by non-Christians, but you still hold on to my name, and that's cool. And he says in verse 13 of chapter 2, you're living right where Satan's throne is. And he follows up in verse 14 with, but I have a few things against you, because you have some there who follow Balaam's teaching. And he goes on to say that some people are following the Nicolaitans' teaching as well. And Nicolaitans are presumably these people who follow the theology wave started by a guy called Nicolaitans. You get it. And then Jesus says something kind of familiar in verse 16. So change your hearts and lives. If you don't, I'm coming to you soon, and I will make war on them with the sword that comes from my mouth. Big statement there. But hold on, we'll get back to it. He finishes the message by saying, if you can hear, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. I will give those who emerge victorious some of the hidden manna to eat. I will also give to each of them a white stone with a new name written on it, which no one knows except the one who receives it. So there's a lot to unpack here. First, Satan's throne, and then Balaam and the Nicolaitans' teachings. Next, he mentions coming to them again, this time to wage war with a mouth sword. And finally, he promises us delicious manna and a nice shiny new rock. So what does this mean? The phrase Satan's throne is kind of a way to throw shade at the region because of what it's known for. Pergamum was the site of the first and most revered temple built to honor Caesar Augustus. And Augustus is not the worst Roman emperor in early Christian history, but a temple honoring a human instead of God definitely made Jews and early Christians uncomfortable because it represented a misplacement of humans' priorities and a distraction from God. And Pergamum was also the site of a huge altar built for the Greek god Zeus. And Christ followers in this region clearly were surrounded by conflicting ideologies. So Jesus' message to them means a lot when he gives them praise for keeping their faith. But the church in Pergamum isn't perfect, and they are definitely influenced by other cultures and traditions. So who are Balaam and this Nicholas guy? Well, Balaam is actually mentioned in the Old Testament, namely in the story of the Moabite king who had it out for the Israelites, and there's a talking donkey and lots of fun stuff, but you can explore that on your own. The point is, Balaam is a non-Jewish prophet and sorcerer kind of guy, and he represents old, antiquated pagan traditions that early Christian leadership wants to move past. They're over it, and knowing that this church still has some followers holding on to these traditions makes the early Christian establishment upset. And similarly, the people following the teachings of Nicholas, called the Nicolaitans, are also getting the core Christ-following characters all worked up. So there's this figure called Nicholas who was from Antioch, and he converted to Judaism, and he was actually appointed one of the first 7 deacons of the faith, which means he was recognized by the apostles and given this position out of great trust. But he had some views and interpretations that the other cats did not agree with, so people who followed him were labeled heretics. But they weren't necessarily kicked out of the faith. They were just this small group of people with different opinions. So this is definitely what John is referring to here, right? The followers of this deacon Nicholas. I don't know. Maybe. Here's the fun thing about religion. The more you study, the less you know. It's very possible that John is referencing people who are practicing their faith in accordance to this tradition of Old Nick, but also this is all written in Greek. And in Greek, Nicholas could be a compound word, Nikolaos, meaning something like controller of the people or conqueror of the laity. So it's definitely a name, but a name with a specific meaning, which might have been given at birth, or it could just be referencing a person or an idea. John could be saying, you're listening to people who are taking advantage of you and making you act like idiots. I don't know. And there's no way of confirming our suspicions. That doesn't mean that there's no truth to be found here, though, because what we just read gives us some truth about being critical of the people who are leading us and being critical about the beliefs and practices that we're holding on to. So many times throughout the New Testament, we are warned against following false prophets. Here in Revelation, earlier in the writings of Saul Polyphar, in Matthew, in Luke, in John, in Titus, 2 Timothy, 2 Peter, all throughout the New Testament, and even in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, we're warned against false prophets. Now, in my opinion, anyone who claims they know anything about God is making a critical mistake. Evelyn Underhill once said, if God were small enough to be understood, he would not be big enough to be worshipped. That's why we call it participating in the mystery of faith, right? There's so much we don't know, and that's totally okay, because at the end of the day, our personal relationship to the divine is what matters, and those individual experiences with the God of many forms and many names are what make our faith true and strong. I think this is kind of what Jesus is talking about when he mentions making war with the sword of my mouth. War here does not have to mean a physical, violent, blood and guts kind of war. Jesus is talking about using his words and teachings to cut away all the falsity and illusion that we often stockpile in our lives and in our beliefs about the world. Whenever we believe something to be true, it can take a lot to change our minds. Humans have this really bad habit of holding on to what they consider truth and letting it become this fortified foundation on which we build our perception and our experience. And sometimes we let misunderstandings become beliefs, and our perception of the world is shaped by these misbeliefs. And changing them can be extremely uncomfortable. To me, Jesus is reminding us here that when we listen to his message, it's not always going to be jellies and fruit snacks, right? Sometimes it's going to feel like his words are a sword because he's chopping through all the junk that we've convinced ourselves is true. And changing our hearts and minds can feel like there's a war going on inside of us. Who mows the lawn at 6:13 p.m.? What? Take a break, bro. Go home. Eat din-din. But we have to be brave through the process, and we have to trust that the pain of finding truth is better than the comfort of living a lie. And we need to remember that just because we've been wrong doesn't mean that it defines us ultimately. We're already forgiven for the mistakes, and grace is offered to us freely, but it's our responsibility to accept it, and accepting it takes work. Jesus says, I will give those who emerge victorious some of the hidden manna to eat, and I will also give to each of them a white stone with a new name written on it, which no one knows except the one who receives it. It sounds to me like Jesus is alluding to the internal war or struggle that we experience when we are brave enough to challenge the beliefs that we've accumulated. And then he's referencing the manna, the sustenance giving to the Israelites back in the Moses days. And then he's using a metaphor to describe the fact that we're pardoned from the things in our past, and our changed hearts and minds make us kind of a new person. Jesus is within you, and he's a part of you, and he's fighting your fight with you. His victory is your victory. But when we do succeed in demolishing the layers of beliefs that we've become so comfortable with, we can feel lost, kind of like the Israelites leaving the only life they knew in Egypt and going into the wilderness with nothing to start again. Jesus says once we're victorious, he'll provide what we need to build a better life, just like God provided manna in the desert. And it might not be obvious. We might not even realize that Jesus is helping us, right? It's hidden manna. Like when you don't make a team you tried out for, but then later you realize that instead of going to practice, you're able to use that time to study or going to church events or building relationships. And you look back and you're like, I'm really glad I had all that free time. Okay, in middle school, there was this kid who sat near me in most of my classes, and he was one of those kids who Whenever you say a joke or have a witty response, he would repeat it, but he'd say it louder and the whole class would laugh. And you're like, that's my joke, dude. And one time I had a really funny response to something my Spanish teacher said, but I said it quietly to make my friends laugh. So of course, the kid repeats it and gets a big laugh, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and he got in a lot of trouble for being disruptive and fomenting insurrection. And I was like, man, that could have been me. And so I thought about that near-death experience for a while, and I realized that getting in trouble and making the teacher upset was not really worth a quick laugh, and that I could learn more and do better if I was focused on the class and not on being a smart aleck or worrying about what the kid next to me was doing. Sometimes the things that you need to learn, or the experiential manna that helps you grow, is not so obvious until you look back on what's happened. It's hidden. The experiences that get us where we need to go don't define us. Jesus says he'll give us a white stone with a new name. And there are actually a couple of interpretations for this, but many of them are referencing the same underlying message. And the one that I think makes the most sense and would be most likely for John to write about here is this. In Roman trials, you would give your case and the jury would hear you and decide whether you were guilty or not guilty. And if a juror thought that you were guilty, they'd put a black stone in a bucket. And if they thought you were not guilty, they'd put a white stone in the bucket. And then all the stones would be dumped out and counted. And if you had more white stones than black stones, then you're not guilty. So I read this as Jesus' promise that in the eyes of the only judge that really matters, your verdict is guaranteed. Judge Jesus has your back. The internal struggles that we feel when we realize we need to change our hearts is really us putting ourselves on trial and wrestling internally with what's right and wrong for us. And when we understand the stuff that we're moving past and accept the new identity that comes from a changed hearts, we're no longer guilty of the things that we left behind. Speaking of wrestling, Jacob back in the Old Testament wrestles with God, and God dislocates his hip, but Jacob doesn't give up and he gets renamed Israel, and his descendants become the Jewish people. And I think that tenacity, that dedication, that commitment, those are admirable traits. And Jesus doesn't want us to back down from the challenge of constantly reevaluating our lives and our hearts, even if that inner conflict feels like a war sometimes. When we're brave enough to accept that challenge and we emerge victorious, we are redeemed with the white stone and renamed, just like Jacob. So after this video, I encourage you to pray to yourself and with your family about being brave enough to let go of the old habits that you have, and letting go of the stale beliefs and practices, and letting the Spirit rebuild you from the inside out to make your faith fresh and strong. It takes courage and an open heart and an open mind, but you've got a great ally in your corner who has a sword coming out of his mouth, so you'll be fine. Hopefully we start meeting in person again soon. When that time comes, I hope you'll join us at Faith UMC in Tulsa, Oklahoma. If you're looking for a way to be in service during this time of social distancing, you can make a donation to Faith to be used for the Provide the Ride campaign. This care portal service provides bus passes to families and clients of DHS who don't have personal vehicles and rely on public transportation to do everything from grocery shopping to dropping off their kids at daycare to attending mandatory appointments like screenings and hearings, which their future and livelihood really depend on. Each pass is $45. You can donate that or really any amount. Faith has already supplied over 200 passes so far, and our goal is to double that number. To donate, follow the link in the description, press Give, select Designated Gift, and write Provide the Ride in the memo line. Thank you so much for watching. Next week, we'll talk about dragons and beasts. So see you then. Peace. Are you hovering right above my house? What? It's a lawnmower. It's not a helicopter.